All right, so this last workshop is about demonstrating your value and how to be confident in the experience that you already have and ace the interview. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. So, interviewing is not a skill that comes naturally to most people. It really is something that you need to practice. It's a learned behavior. So, I want you to, keep that in mind for those of you that do struggle with interviews, because, for most of us, that is something that we have to really put to practice. And so much of interviewing is really about confidence. This is a bigger piece than most people realize. I'm sure that you guys, have seen candidates getting jobs that, maybe they weren't the most qualified for, but they interviewed the best. That happens all the time. So confidence really can make a big difference in that. We do have an exercise in your workbook that you guys can take a look at. We refer to it as the confidence vault, kind of keeping with the resume bank, confidence vault bank theme, I guess. But just to get you thinking about ways to talk about yourself that maybe you haven't before. So there's a couple exercises in there to talk to some folks, friends, family, and get an idea of what they see you as the go-to person for, and some of those strengths, because I think sometimes we don't realize what our strengths are if we're just naturally good at something until we get some of that feedback. Michael and I have talked before because Excel is something, Microsoft Excel is something that I'm really good at. And didn't necessarily realize that, some of the things that I was doing in Excel were, things that were kind of at an advanced level until, he saw me doing some of that and he's like, oh, that's, pretty cool. And so sometimes having that feedback will make you realize, oh, maybe this is something that I need to speak more to.
Yeah, for sure. Confidence is just one of those things that it's difficult to deal with, right? I mean, if you are feeling nervous, you instantly kind of get pulled out of a situation, right? But one thing I just want you guys to remember is like you're badasses, right? The things that you are good at are uniquely yours. And I want you to own that. And a lot of people will tell me, they don't feel comfortable bragging on themselves. And it becomes, difficult in interviews because people don't like talking about themselves. One thing that I'll tell you is that's universally true of most non-sociopaths. They don't really like talking about themselves. I want you to stop thinking about it as bragging, though, because that's not really what you're doing when you're having an effective interview. Rather than bragging, what you're actually doing is you're having a conversation with someone about a thing that you can legitimately offer them, which is a skill that you have that they are lacking and that they need. Right. So it's not really being braggadocious or being full of yourself. It's really just having a good communication with that person.
So I want to take a look at some of the things that we can do to prepare for interviews. The first thing that you want to think about, a couple things that I would say as far as getting ready. One, research the organization. This is so important to do your research beforehand, and it can really set you apart. I think you'd be surprised at the number of candidates that don't necessarily know that much about the organization that they are interviewing for because, maybe they've applied several different places or maybe they just didn't take the time. So, doing that can be definitely something that can set you apart. And then reviewing your resume, remind yourself of key achievements that are relevant to this role that you can raise. Know your numbers on your resume so that you can bring these up if you have specific, percentages that you increased, student success by, or, different things. Think about that so that you can speak to it. And then your key stories. So, what are key stories? These are going to be things that you can draw from so that you have a couple of stories prepared. So, think about things like a time when you resolved a conflict, a time when you dealt with a difficult deadline, a time when you worked on a project that was relevant to this type of role. We have an exercise in your workbook for this, but I would really think about putting together a few of these stories beforehand, it'll help you to be more prepared when you go into those interviews so that you can have these three pieces. You've done your research, maybe you've made note of some of those key points of interest about the company that you can raise during the interview. Like if they're working on a project that you think is really cool, you can raise that. You've reviewed your resume and you know what those stories are that you're going to tell. And then a few other things for getting ready. Practicing responses is really important because interviewing is not a natural skill. Most of us will do better with some practice. So certainly don't need to know your answers word for word, but being familiar with the common questions and having ideas prepared for how you might answer those will definitely help. And then have questions prepared for them. Generally, we would say at least 2 to 3 questions prepared for them, and we'll have a couple of examples later in this workshop. But we do want you to think about interviewing as a two-way street. You are interviewing that company as much as they're interviewing you, and so we want to make sure it's a good fit for you as much as you are they're wanting to make sure that it's a good fit for them. So in that vein, you want to make sure that you're asking questions and engaging with them as well and having that conversation. And then get in the right mindset. It's important, we found, to have the right mood going in and kind of set that for yourself. So Michael and I are very different on this in terms of preparing for interviews or even preparing for things like this boot camp and kind of getting in that mindset. He likes to listen to like rap music or like metal music and things that just really get him amped up beforehand to get him excited, because I tend to be a little bit more stressed out when I'm interviewing. I need to listen to like meditative music and things that will kind of calm me down. Hence the little symbols that you guys see here. So we're very different on that. So whatever, will help you to get in the best mindset, whether it's listening to, a certain type of music or maybe, a podcast or something that will kind of help you to, feel like you're going to be in the best mode.
Yeah, for sure. For me, I think part of it is I already have that nervous energy. And so I want to take that nervous energy and really take it up to 10 because I want to go in, I want to be shaking hands, I want to be kissing babies, coming in that very politician excited mindset, right? And that's a part of my brand, I guess, and it's a part of the kind of jobs that I go for. I don't go for a lot of you know, reserved jobs. Oh, can other folks hear us? Okay, so Maria, it might be you may need to just hop off and hop back on. There may be something that's going on, or maybe a button got pressed on your thing. Um, yeah, Casey, I totally recommend that Calm app for anyone who needs calming sounds, music, mantras before an interview. That's a good idea. I'm afraid I would be put to sleep, but I think Rebecca should definitely take care of that.
Yeah, and James, the mindful breathing is definitely something for me too. So that definitely helps.
So I want to talk to you guys about three types of interview questions. So I will tell you that a lot of different, hopefully that helped. I just heard you come back in. So hopefully you can hear us this time. Um, I could tell you that I've been through a lot of kind of horrible interviews before. And because we work with clients and I talk to a lot of folks on LinkedIn, I've heard a lot of horrible interview questions before. So I can't solve that problem, unfortunately. But what I can do is tell you about really basically the three types of common interview questions. And we can talk a little bit about how we answer them and what those questions really are for. The first kind of question that you will encounter in an interview is considered the interpersonal question. So an interpersonal question, what it does is it shows how you relate to other folks and how you interact with them. It's a way for the employer to assess the candidate and kind of figure out if they fit. It's really a fit question more than it is a can they do the job question. What I will tell you here is to be very honest and Highlight those soft skills like communication skills and collaboration, teamwork, team building, all of those sort of touchy feely soft skills that you've got. Those are great things to highlight in an interpersonal question. Here's some examples of some interpersonal questions that I've asked, I've been asked, and I've seen. So, have you ever had a coworker that you didn't get along with? This is the kind of question that folks will ask because they want to get an idea of your conflict resolution skills and strategies, right? How would your coworkers describe you? This is a lot about we want to know how you kind of act around people so that we can understand if you make sense. And how do you handle criticism? Another good way to ask somebody how they handle something that might be difficult. These, along with many others, are examples of interpersonal questions, and they are really good at the thing that they do, which is let us know if you fit or not. The next type of question, it depends on who you ask, what it'll be called, um, but situational or behavioral. These are the kinds of questions that I call them tell me about a time question because that is so often how they start. Tell me about a time when you blank. Um, these are to see how you handle situations that may arise in the workplace. Um, this is a way for you to focus on past experiences, how you've demonstrated certain behaviors and skills, and how you can take something that you did and relate that to something that they may need you to do. This also helps with fit, but it helps with the can and the will you do the job questions as well. I see a question in the chat from Casey. Um, you want me to be covering this, but I'm hoping to talk a little bit about performance tasks that some companies make you do between rounds of interviews. Yeah, we can definitely talk about that. I'll hold that until we get kind of done with the interview pieces, and then we'll talk a little bit about that for sure. So here are some examples of some situational questions. Tell me about a time when you had multiple deadlines to manage. This is just trying to get a little bit of strategy out of you. Give me an example of a time you faced a conflict at work. How did you handle it? If you notice, this is a similar type of question to the last set of interpersonal questions, but this is much more about a specific situation. It wants you to go in detail about a story. And can you describe a time when you made a mistake at work and what you did about it? I like this question. I will typically ask a similar version of this question. My goal is to find out like how you handle failure because we all fail at something, and honestly, in a lot of jobs, you fail all the time, and it's how we interpret those failures is how we measure success. And so I like to ask that question, and I think a lot of good interviewers do. So some of you all may have heard of this method, some of you may not. This is a great method to answer situational or behavioral questions, or in general, a great way to tell a story, period. Because it is a short and succinct way to get every piece of a story out. It's called the STAR method. It is the situation, the task required, the action you took, and the result that you learned. What that really means and what we are really going into there is this is the order in which you will tell that story. So you will start with the situation or background. You don't need to give a million details, just enough for that interviewer to understand where you're coming from. Then you're going to describe the task that was required of you. In the example of tell me about a time you had a conflict with someone at work, you might give a little bit of background of who the person was. Like, they were a peer or they were a supervisor or that sort of thing. Then you'd go into the task. This is the thing we were working on where this arised. The action you took is the thing that you did with them. So an example might be, when I realized that we had a conflict, I started speaking to them directly about how we could solve that. To kind of work with that resolution. And then the last piece is the result or what you learn. So after having this conversation with this person, these are the action items that I took away. This is the thing that I learned, and this is how how I handle this in the future. That could be any of those pieces could be part of that result. And finally, these questions, the technical questions. So technical questions, have to do directly with the job, and the technical skills that are required. Most jobs have some version of a technical skill that's required. Whether it is ability to train large groups or ability to work with large data sets, whatever that may be. These questions allow you to highlight transferable skills, even if you don't have direct experience. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we get into specific examples. But the idea here is you may not always have done the exact thing that they ask you about. What we want you to do is search your mind for something that you did that's similar, or something that you did that is likely something that would relate, and answer that way. So here are some examples. Obviously, technical ones will be the ones that are the most different across jobs. So this is just a few examples. If I gave you this Excel file, what would be the steps you would take to prepare it for our director's report? What automated build tools or processes have you used? What human resource management software are you familiar with? So these all just give you ability to talk about the things that you've done, and answer things that you've done, or answer things that are transferable. Say I've never used any human resource management software, but I have used a learning management system. I may say, well, I haven't used human resource management software. I am familiar with it. I do know that it is, software to track things that you do in human resources. I actually was the administrator of our learning management system, which is similar and captures similar data. And I know that with time, I'd be able to learn how to do that. Right? That's a good example of a way to use transferable skills with those kind of questions.
All right, so we're going to take a look at some common questions and go through a few examples. And we have kind of a fun exercise that we're going to do here, where I'm going to have a couple of questions for Michael with interview questions. And then he's going to go through two ways to answer a wrong way, or maybe not the best way to answer it, and then a better way to answer. So let's take a look at these. So, Michael, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm originally from a small town outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I moved to this town about 5 years ago. I've got four cats that I absolutely love. Um, I like gardening and mountain biking. And yeah, I am a former teacher.
All right, so let's take a look at maybe a better way to answer that one. So,
Yeah. I have a professional background in both policy analysis and education. Um, I've significantly advanced in the last 5 years through roles. I've been working with the Department of Transportation for 5 years. In those 5 years, I've held two different positions. I'm now currently the manager of the position that I started in. And I know that the skills that I have gotten over the last 5 years will allow me to be the best lead trainer that available for your organization. And one of the reasons that I applied for this position today is that I see how much that my skills over the last 5 years have really aligned with your job advertisement.
all right, so you can see going through those two examples, the first answer that Michael gave had a lot more personal components, which is something that we see a lot of folks do because, the tell me about yourself question can feel so broad that, sometimes people aren't really sure how to answer or where to go. And it can feel almost a little bit like a trap. And so, people can fall into that, well, let me tell you about, kind of some of the things that I like, or, tell you about my kids. And, we want you to keep this professional, not personal. So in that second example, he was much more focused and told me what he's done, why he's interested in this position, and exactly how his skills align. But he still kept it concise. So we want you to respond with a, focused statement that summarizes your career and relate it to why you're interested in this position. Leeds School of Business has a formula that they have created for your elevator pitch, or answer to this question that we like. And the three parts that they talk about are: who are you and what's your goal? Why are you pursuing this goal? And then what are your differentiators? So those are some things that you can think about when it comes to telling people about yourself and, kind of giving them a short pitch as far as to why you'd be good for that role. So we're going to take a look at another one. So, Michael, can you tell me about a time that you handled a conflict at work? What was the outcome and how did it affect you?
Yeah. So I had a situation when I worked in social services where I was taking calls for SNAP benefits, and I had a customer who got really upset with me about his case being denied. Um, Basically, what I did is I explained to him the reason why, and once he had that information, he seemed to calm down quite a bit.
All right, so let's look at maybe a better way to answer that one.
Yeah. So you know, when I worked in social services previously, I was taking calls for SNAP benefits. It's That's also known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or commonly known as food stamps. So, just for clarification on that, I had a customer that got really upset about his case being denied. It was really difficult to hear his situation, and in that situation, I could understand why he was upset. Unfortunately, there was a valid reason for why that case closed, and I spent some time with him, helping him understand what had changed, where his situation had changed, and you know how he could remedy that in the future if the situation changed again. Um, Being there and being empathetic with him, and going through the situation in a calm and appropriate manner really calmed him down, and he was able to understand what was going on. And I think that's how I would handle that in the future.
All right. So in the first example that Michael gave when he answered that question, he didn't tell me the full situation of what happened, and he didn't really answer every part of the question. We were also asking him how it affected him, personally, and what was the outcome. So when he answered that again, he gave, a more complete answer and really walked through the star method of going through the situation, the task that he was responsible for with this customer, the action that he took to help to resolve the situation, and then the result and what he learned from it. And he made sure to answer each part of the question going through. And when you do have multi-part questions, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to remember each piece as you're going back through. So it's definitely okay to ask for the question to be repeated, or you can even answer one part of it and then say, can you repeat the question as well? All right. So the third question that I have for you, Michael, do you have any experience working in this type of role?
No, no, I don't.
So that's actually an answer that some people give if you're asked a more technical question is, do you have experience, with data analysis, or do you have experience, with this type of role? Is just, well, no, I really don't. So there's a better way to answer that. So
Yeah, so I've not held a specific data analyst role myself, but I do have experience in previous jobs synthesizing data in my current and former roles. So in my last job, I was responsible for compiling our department's annual report, which does require me to analyze data from multiple sources. In my current role, I utilize a procurement system to analyze data by setting parameters and preparing summaries for our director. So while I haven't held this specific role, those experiences me have prepared me a great deal for handling a role like this one.
yeah, so what we want you to keep in mind when you have specific, technical questions, if you don't have direct experience in that, avoid answering with just a no. There's likely a way because you are interviewing for the position, so you're clearly qualified for it, or at least they perceived you to be qualified for it, or they wouldn't have asked you for an interview. So you can think about ways to relate other types of work experience, training, tools that you've used, or softwares like Michael was mentioning earlier with the human resources and learning management software. Think about other things that might be similar, and almost think about it like a politician would answer it, right?
Yeah, so we're coming into election season again in November. It feels like we're basically never leaving election season. For those of you guys who follow politics closely, when I say think like a politician here, what I really mean is you'll never have a politician just say, "Nah." they will always deflect and change. Um, you know, almost to a point of hilarity. So I'm not asking you to go that route. But if you do get asked a question that puts you outside of your comfort zone, it's okay to redirect into a place that is adjacent that you are more comfortable. Um, you know, watching political debates is a great way to learn how to do this effectively and not so effectively.
And then there's some other common interview pitfalls that we want to walk through here. So the first is, when talking about any sort of weak areas or struggles that you have, never leave it on a negative note, but always focus on what you are doing to improve. So, maybe if time management is a weakness, for you, focus on what you're doing to improve in that area and maybe what specific steps that you've taken. Another common pitfall that we see is talking negatively about your current job or employer. I think you might be surprised how many folks, do this or kind of borderline on ranting about their role. And a lot of you are, educators. There is, a lot of, negativity in the space, and understandably so, about the system and some of the struggles there. But the interview is not a time to talk about that. It's not a time to rant or tell them about, it's okay to tell them about some of the struggles that you faced and why you are leaving education, but it's not okay to focus on the negative. And there's kind of a difference between negativity and being critical there, right?
Yeah. So, we work with a lot of clients who are transitioning because they are leaving a bad situation. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. That is a piece of that. And so we've had clients come to us in the past and say, Mike, I don't understand how I can answer this question. You told me I can't be negative, but you asked me why I'm leaving. And I'm leaving because this is miserable. And so my answer to that is that there is a big difference between being critical of a situation and being negative. Being negative is going into, well, my boss sucks, my job sucks, everybody's rude, I'm underpaid, and quite frankly, I don't want to be there anymore. Then or there's an easier way to go about that, and that way is to kind of go in and talk about, well, as you may know, in leaving education, there are several of us that are doing that. You may have seen that in the news that up to 25% of teachers are considering leaving. There are difficult situations that we're going through. And rather than, have to work inside of that difficult situation, I've thought deep about the types of strengths that I have and the places where I would fit more. And that's why I'm here today. Right. So I talked about the same thing. Job sucks, but I didn't talk about it in the same way. I talked about, I kept the part where I was critical at a closer to a surface level, and then ended with out of that critique into something positive, which is I now am looking for the thing that fits my purpose.
Couple other pitfalls here. Another one is the tendency to try to fill silence during an interview. Sometimes when you give an answer to an interview question, the person who's interviewing you, or maybe if it's a panel that's interviewing you, they might be writing down the answer to your question or taking some notes, and there might be some silence. A lot of folks will fall into the trap of rambling after that and trying to fill that silence, and you can turn a great answer into maybe a less than great one when you kind of keep going on that. So, if you've sufficiently answered the question, stop, and it's okay to, just have a little bit of a pause if the interviewers are taking notes. So that's something that we often encourage folks when we're doing mock interviews with clients, is to embrace the pause a little bit and try to be comfortable with some of that silence. And then, avoid saying anything in the interview that would make yourself look like a short-term hire or flight risk. Some of you who are transitioning, the next role that you're looking to get is likely not the role that you're looking to be in for 5 years, 10 years, right? It may be a step in that next, direction and a step in the right direction. But it may be a, still a little bit of a transitional job where you're going to step into that and then step into that. And maybe it's, a role that will allow you to gain some additional skills and upskill in the area that you ultimately want to go. But we definitely want to avoid, setting off any red flags for the employer during the interview that would, cause them to think that they're not going to want to invest that time into training you. So if you're not planning on, staying in the role long term, you could still talk about your desire to grow within the company. Because maybe there's opportunities within the company for you to promote and things like that. So that, they're seeing that maybe you don't want to be in that particular role for 5 years, but you're open to opportunities to start within that role, and ultimately you want to grow, within the company and kind of see, what opportunities arise for you there.
For folks who don't know, the magic number that we think about on the hiring side is 18 months. If we can keep you for 18 months, chances are you are worth paying the money to train. And the average amount of time that a modern American employee spends in a job is around 18 months. So we know that you're not going to stay forever, especially if it's an entry-level position. Like we talked about yesterday when we were talking during group coaching, when we were looking at those kinds of things. So we know that likely that next position is going to be more of an entry level position, and that you probably are looking to make a little more money than what that entry level is. And the person interviewing you knows that too. They just want you to know that you are in it for the long haul, with the company at least.
And then I know we had a question earlier about some of the performance tasks and things that might be required. So I think this might be a good point before we go into, some of the questions that you guys might want to ask at an interview, to talk about some of those tasks that they might be requiring of you during an interview process.
Yep, absolutely. So, Casey, if I'm understanding you correctly, when you're talking about performance tasks that companies make you do between rounds of interviews, we're talking about things like maybe a writing sample, or maybe here's an example of a data sheet that, because this is a data analyst role and we want you to analyze it and come up with findings, or we want you to make a PowerPoint present, whatever it is. There's a million of them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I think the easiest way is to talk to you about the way that I do it. Yes, that is a problem. And I want to address that they sometimes take a really long time as well. And there's some kind of talk about that in the hiring circles. So I will say that as a manager, I do samples for my employees. I keep them at less than an hour because I know that your time is valuable and I'm not paying you. Typically, what they should be used for is to do something that legitimately would let me know whether or not you're a good fit for the role. So I hate it when they seem like busy work or like, why would anyone need to do this? This feels like a school assignment. Typically, I will have something that is very, very specific to the job, and I'll keep it short. I think that they do act as a really good way to find out if someone is capable and qualified. The problem is that when they get into that, they take a really long time section, and it makes you wonder, like, do I really want to put in this work? There is a movement out there, and I don't know how serious it is or how successful it will be, to normalize paying folks for writing samples or for work that they're doing. There are people out there who are saying you need to refuse to do writing samples or work samples unless you're getting paid for them. I need a job, so I will probably do it. But I do understand the sentiment there.
And one thing that can also, help, that I would encourage if you're not doing this already, is to make sure that you understand their interview process going in. So if you get invited for, the initial interview, asking them about the steps. Some companies are more transparent about this than others, because I've seen companies where you go to apply and on the initial application, they list on there, these are the steps in the hiring process. You're going to have a recruiter screening. You're going to have an interview with the hiring manager. You're going to have a work sample. You're going to have an interview with this panel of peers. Then you're going to have an interview with the director. And like, they tell you up front, but sometimes that transparency is not there. So I would definitely encourage, that conversation to understand what those steps are in the hiring process early on so that you know what's going to be expected of you. And then you aren't thrown off guard when you're going through 4 or 5 interviews and multiple work samples and feeling like you've invested a lot of time.
Yeah, I can tell you there was a question about what is the typical amount of rounds of interviews that you go through for one job. I have seen this range from 1 to 7 ish. Um, I typically, so as a hiring manager, I do 3. It's a work sample, a panel interview, and a one-on-one interview. That's like a very, very similar. That's a very standard way for me to do a panel. We've had clients, the example that we used of our client who moved into the video game sector, she had 5. And those 5 interviews, it started with, an interview with the supervisor that was 30 minutes and relatively short, and then moved into interviewing with the teams and then ultimately with the director. We've seen a lot more companies that are doing 3 to 5 rounds. It's not unheard of anymore.
What we've also seen is, for companies who are hiring candidates for remote roles, I think it's also been a priority to do a little bit more interviews for remote roles because they aren't getting to know you as personally. And so they want to vet their candidates a little bit more. So they are having a few more interviews. So I've seen that it's a little bit more common, in the tech space or in, some of those fully remote roles to have, more like 3 to 5 rounds than 1 to 2 rounds. So ultimately it's up to you as a candidate, what is, going to be appropriate for you and your time and how much that you want to invest. But I do think having that conversation early and upfront is definitely important so that you know what they're going to expect from you and if that's going to be, okay for your time.
Yeah, and that actually gets us um, into kind of questions that you would ask at interviews, right? So, when you go to an interview, we do, and we've said it here before, and I'll say it again, but when we interview, you want it to be a conversation. You don't want it to feel like a firing squad. You don't want it to be this person's going to ask me questions. All I do is answer. And because the best interviews are the ones that end up starting to feel like a conversation. So as they ask you a question, you answer that question. Maybe you have a follow up piece for it. Maybe they have a follow up piece for it, and you go. And then when the interview starts to end, it's good for you to start thinking about things that you need to know and things that you want to know. Um, I always, and I don't score interviews, but I always kind of think about someone a little more fondly as they leave if they've asked a couple of thought provoking questions. Um, when you do your first interview, often the questions are a little bit lower level or a little bit higher level, rather, because you don't know as much about what's going on. So we have a handful of questions here that you can consider. Obviously, if you have a legitimate question that you need to know the answer to, that's the best question to ask. But things like, what is the most important thing for someone to succeed, to be successful in this position? Understanding that a little bit, because when you do go to that second and third interview, knowing answers like that will help you be more confident. Can you tell me more about the company and the team culture? Again, if you're going to work there, you want to know if you actually like the company and the team culture. So learning a little bit more about that. And then as a base level question, knowing more about the next steps in the hiring process, being able to get a little bit more information about what their steps are. Do they have a typical, thing that they do with everybody? Is it a smaller company and they're a little more ad hoc? That's possible, but asking that question will help a lot. And then, as you continue into second, third, fourth, fifth, hopefully no more than that interviews, you can start asking more thought provoking, a little bit deeper questions because you've learned a little bit more about the company as you've gone through. I like to ask this question: is there any additional information you need from me to make your decision? This is sort of a go straight to jail, like free pass, kind of like Monopoly question. Because basically, what this question does is, if I've asked you a bunch of questions, you've answered, and there's something that you haven't talked about that I wish you talked about. It gives that employer an opportunity to say, actually, we didn't talk a lot about data analysis, but it is a core component of this position. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've done there? Or, I'd just like to hear a little more about what you've done in this, whatever it is. It gives you that ability to restart that conversation if there was something that they were doubting, and leave them without that doubt before you walk out the door. Asking about opportunities for professional development or advancement. This allows them to know, that you are interested in sticking around, that you want to know where you can get better. And again, asking about hiring, excuse me, asking about the when you expect a hiring decision is useful because you kind of want to know when you're going to get a job.
Yeah.
Um, these kinds of questions and more, I think, are really, really valuable to start thinking about when you're going.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so let's talk about some ways that you might follow up during an interview. So, a couple different things that we want you to think about when it comes to following up after the interview. When you reach out, there's kind of some things that you could put in there to help yourself set apart, be set apart, and remind them of why you're there. So you want to thank them for their time and the opportunity. Bring up something memorable from the interview. Maybe there was a moment that you guys talked about, and that was something that you feel like it would be really cool, or a really important skill that you could highlight. Bring that up when you follow up. Remind them of your qualifications just briefly. Pull out a couple of things that you think would be the biggest highlight to them and raise that, and then invite them to reach out to you. So we have an example of what this might look like as kind of a follow-up template that you could use after an interview. Hi, Michael. Thank you again for your time today and the opportunity to interview for the position. I was really excited to learn that the company is working on blank, as I'm very passionate about blank. So you're talking about, something memorable or something that, really excites you about that position, and kind of restating that. Based on what I learned about the role, I believe my skills in blank would be a great fit for this particular role. So you're reminding them of, what sets you apart. And then I look forward to hearing from you soon to discuss next steps. And I'm available to chat if you have any further questions, kind of putting the ball in their court.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, really what you're doing there, and this again, stealing from sales, you're asking for that micro commitment, always leaving them with an action item for them to do. That way, they're more likely to reach back out to you. If it's just sort of like, "Thank you so much for the interview," they may not email back and say you're welcome. But if you say thank you for the interview, what else do I need to know? I'm available to chat. It gives them that ability to come in. So this is a piece that um, we like to save kind of to the end, because obviously it's the thing that happens after the interview when you're lucky. And it's difficult. And I think it's difficult for a lot of our folks, because a lot of our folks come from the public sector, come from um, teaching, education, those sorts of things, where negotiation just sort of isn't a thing. I mean, my salary is on a website. Thank you, Governor DeSantis. If you guys want to know how much I make in my day job, you can look it up. So there's not a lot of negotiation that's happening in the sectors that a lot of our clients are coming from. And so when they're going into negotiation, they feel overwhelmed. So let's talk about it a little bit, and let's break it down so that it becomes something that feels a little bit easier and feels a little bit more routine. So when you're negotiating, you want to come from a place of strength and a place of knowledge. So how do you do that? You need to research, research, research. You want to know the market value of the position to the best of your ability, and Google's your friend. Honestly, the websites are good. I mean, LinkedIn does what it can. Indeed has some salary features that it aggregates. Um, Honestly, I will look at those places, but I'll just Google too, because there are a lot of cost of living websites out there that you can kind of aggregate yourself. You also want to know the market value of the place you live. Are you working in the Bay Area? You need to make Bay Area money. Tallahassee doesn't need to make Bay Area money. So you need to go in from that place of strength. When you're there, you also need to know your skills and what you bring to the table. Um, Looking at the job advertisement is a great way. Honestly, pro tip, save that job advertisement as a PDF when you apply for it, especially if it's one that you're really interested in, because you're going to want it later when they pull that job ad down and you're going for your third, fourth, fifth interview and then negotiation. Chances are that job ad isn't there anymore because they are interviewing for it. So if you've got a copy of it, you can use that to your advantage later on when you are looking and seeing, like, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. And then when they come in and they say, we are looking to offer between 50 and 70,000 for this position, you can say, well, in looking at what you are asking for, I meet a majority of the qualifications, including this one that you said that you preferred. I have done for multiple years. So I believe that I should be in the top end of your negotiation, or in the top end of your salary range. That gives you a place of power to come in. I'm hitting my wife because I'm starting to get really handsy
So
when I
excited.
talk. You always want to come in with a piece of knowledge that you can use to your advantage. Because if you come in and you say, well, I want to make 70,000. Okay, why? They're not going to come in. What you want to do is come in and say, based off of this data, and based off of my qualifications, I deserve 68,000 for this position. And then you stop talking. Because is the worst thing that you can do is ramble on. And I think I'm moving ahead of my pieces. But the worst thing that you can do is ramble on a little bit and kind of go, because when you start doing that and you start, you're afraid of the silence, you're afraid of making the ask and then stopping the talk, is you end up putting yourself in a position where you start weakening your argument.
Yeah, and I see a question from Casey, so I want to go back to this really quick about some of these pieces on negotiating things that aren't salary. So there are certainly other things that you can negotiate. Think about things like benefits, paid time off. Is something that can be negotiated in a lot of industries. Remote work flexibility can often be negotiated, whether that's a requirement that maybe you only have to go in, a couple days a week, or it's a hybrid type of role. Sometimes, especially if they can't quite get the salary right to what you're looking for, you could think about kind of bringing that in and negotiating some flexibility to make that total package a little bit closer to what you're looking for.
Yeah, home office stipends.
Yeah, yeah.
There are lots of places that you can go with that, and you know, you are negotiating for your total compensation package. That's kind of that's the HRE word for that, is the total compensation package. Some places have more flexibility than others in that negotiation. Some places have kind of a bog standard. This is what we give for benefits, and they really can only negotiate with salary and maybe bonuses. Signing bonuses is another thing, or moving bonus, or there are lots of places. And I will tell you, from a company perspective, you may ask, okay, well, if I ask for 70,000 and they tell me that they can give me 60,000 with a chance for a $10,000 bonus, why won't they just give me the 70,000? And the thing that I will tell you from a company perspective is sometimes budgets are really complicated for large organizations, and they may only have some folks will, depending on the industry, HRD funds is the name that a lot of HR people will call it. It's human resources dollars. It's the money that comes from salary. They may only have a certain amount of HRD funds that they can give out, but they have other expense funds or all of these other things, and they are able to pull from those. So when you go in to negotiate and you look at it from an overall perspective, they may be thinking like, I can only get to this number here, but I might be able to play with some of the numbers around the margin that are in different buckets.
Yeah, we've even had folks who have been able to negotiate remote work equipment, or different stipends and things like that. So there's other things that you can think about and ask them about. So I would definitely not be shy to make that ask. And obviously the salary is the place that everyone wants to go first, because that's generally the most important piece that folks are concerned about. But then think about all of these other things as part of your total compensation package, because the amount of time that you have off, some of that flexibility and things like that are really important too. And then I want to also, go back to a piece on here on, making sure not to base the requests that you're making on your previous salary. Because I think a lot of folks who are in industries, that maybe aren't super well paid, can fall into that trap of thinking, well, this role makes more than I already make, and I'm making this, and so I'd be happy with maybe like 5,000 more, 10,000 more, and I'd be good. And can sometimes shoot themselves in the foot a little bit because they don't understand the market value for that role, and they maybe could have gotten something higher, but they weren't necessarily thinking about that. They were just thinking about it as a raise from what they were making before. So your worth in a new role is not based on your current salary.
Yep, not at all.
Yeah, if you're underpaid in the industry that you're in, that is completely irrelevant to what you're looking for. So they don't need to know that information. You don't need to share with them what you currently make, because your value is based on what you bring. And then we also have a piece on here about, starting above your bottom line. Because I think that, sometimes folks can get nervous when you're thinking about making that ask, and, the range that you're sharing with them. And you want to allow a little bit of flexibility and room, kind of thinking about like a car salesman, right?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. I don't remember if it was during the group coaching or during happy hour or where we were at the time, but yesterday we talked a little bit about when you get into that mode, you never want them to know your bottom line. Quite frankly, you want to go in from a position where you are asking above your lowest, to the point where at worst case scenario they hit your rock bottom. At best case scenario they say yes, or they hit somewhere in the middle. But you don't want them to know your rock bottom, because the moment they know the lowest number that you'll take is the moment that they hire you at that lowest number. There are a lot of things out there on LinkedIn. There are a lot of like influencer CEOs that are out there that will do these posts that get huge numbers, because people like this feel good stuff. But they'll post and they'll say, I hired someone yesterday. I asked them how much they wanted to make. They said 47,000. I knew I could pay them 100, so I paid them 100. Great. And that person got 800 likes for their company and a lot of reshares. And that's just not how the world works most of the time. I hate to break it to you, it's not happening. If I figure out, and not I, because I think I'm a better person than this, but if I figure out, and I'm, not the nicest hiring manager in the world, that you'd settle for 50 and I have the budget for 80, I can hire you at 50 and then hire another part-timer for 30. And I get two workers for the cost of one. So you want to come in above your bottom, so that you don't have to worry about that, so that you get the thing that you need ultimately. And it's okay to say no. I mean, if you get to the point where you're negotiating, we had a client recently who was in a negotiation, and the number was getting to a point where it was below where she wanted to be. And she was working with them. They were going back and forth. They really wanted her, clearly, because they went back and forth and back and forth. It was not this number, this number. It took a long time. She ultimately took the job. They got her exactly where she needed to be, not a dollar more, but they wanted to pay her a lot less. And she really wanted to take the job because she wanted out. But we encouraged her to not give in. The hard part is when you start in an industry low, and Rebecca has had some experience in this, where she started at a position relatively low, because she took an entry level position and they paid her at the lower end of that entry level position. When you go to promote later, it actually cuts your knees out from under you, because if you start way lower than your peers and they go to do a cost of living raise, or they give you a raise, or you promote within the same company, they're going to look at that low salary and they are going to base it a little bit off of that, if not completely. So if you take a way lower than market value for the position, say 50,000, when all of your peers are paying 70, when you go to get that 5%, you stay way below them each time. So when you make that negotiation, you want to get to a place where it's fair compensation. It's okay to say no. And on the other side of that, because I know we need to pay our mortgages, it's okay to say yes sometimes too. I mean, like, this is all the thing about negotiation is it is you. You have to ultimately live with that decision. So that's that rant over. We've talked about a lot of this part, but when you're going to make the ask, don't act like you're inconveniencing them. Sorry to bother you, sir, but I wanted to see if maybe we could work on the salary. No, you go in and you say, hey, I see that you offered 60,000. I want to know if we're a little bit flexible on this because I know the things that I bring to the table, like X, Y, and Z, and what I'd actually like to make is 65. Can you make that happen? And then you stop. And then you let them make that decision. Silence after you ask is important because they may need to think, they may need to talk, they may be waiting to see if you cave. There are all sorts of reasons why silence is important.